So in this lecture, we will be going over the LEQs, or the long essay question for AP History. This is the same standard and rubric that all of the AP History classes are going to be using. So whether you're in AP World or AP Euro or AP US History, it's all going to be the same basic format. So first up, with the LEQ, that is going to be about 40 minutes of writing time. Now, 5 of those minutes should be spent for brainstorming, so coming up with an outline for your thesis and addressing what the question is asking. Then the remaining 35 minutes should be spent writing an introductory paragraph and at least 2 body paragraphs. Now, if you add in an additional body paragraph, that can help to contribute towards the complexity point, okay, but that's not a guarantee that you'll get the complexity point. There's other parts that go in with that. In terms of the percentage of the LEQ, what it is worth on the AP exam, the LEQ is worth the least out of all of the parts of the parts of the AP exam. So you have the multiple choice being worth the most, then the DBQ, then the SAQ, and then the LEQ being worth the least out of all of those parts of the exam. With the LEQ, you do have 3 different prompts to pick from. Prompts are just questions. So the first prompt that you'll read is question 1, or in this case, since the DBQ is question 1, this would be question 2. So the first one would cover period 1 to period 2, the 1200s to the 1750s. This would include a question like on the Mongols, or on the Aztec or Incan Empire, or the Columbian Exchange, something along those lines within that time period. We've already covered the period 1 part of our curriculum, so if y'all were to take the AP exam today, then question 2 would be the LEQ I would encourage you to pick. Question 3 goes from period 2 to period 3, the 1450s to the 1900s. So this could include a question on the revolutions, like the American Revolution or the Mexican Revolution. It could include the Industrial Revolution. It could include the Columbian Exchange, old imperialism or new imperialism. Question 4 covers period 3 to period 4, which is the 1750s until today. Okay, so up to 2001 at the time of the creation of this video. This is the LEQ question that is picked the least often by students, unless it's something that they had literally just covered. Okay, but typically these first 2, question 2 and question 3, covering periods 1 through 3, are the favorites on the actual AP exam in terms of what the students want to answer. Now, in terms of how you start brainstorming, okay, for your 5 minutes, the first thing that you should do is identify the question that you're going to answer. So if it's going to be question 2, in this case, something covering period 1 and 2, we would have to identify the historical thinking skill for that prompt. That will either be comparison, so compare and contrast, continuity and change over time, so what continued versus what changed, or causation, cause and effect. It will never ever cover context, because context is going to be in every single essay. Okay, once you've figured out what your historical thinking skill is for that prompt, then you've got to figure out the time frame. If you're answering question 2 for period 1 and period 2, then obviously the time frame is going to be from the 1200s to the 1750s. And when you're answering your prompt, you're going to want to make sure that you stay within that time frame. Okay, so if it talks about state building or empire building during this time frame, you won't want to go and talk about the American Revolution and then eventually Teddy Roosevelt and his views on imperialism. That would be outside of the time frame. You've got to stick within 1200s to 1750s. Then you need to figure out the main question. Okay, what are we being asked to do? Are we being asked to compare and contrast Spanish exploration in period 2 versus Portuguese exploration? Are we being asked to compare and contrast old imperialism with new imperialism? You need to figure out what is it exactly that it's asking for. Because if it asks for maritime trade with Europeans like the Spanish and the Portuguese, but then all you talk about is the Indian Ocean trade with talking about the Delhi state or the Mughal Empire, well, that's not going to answer the question that was asked. So you're going to want to make sure that you break down what the question is asking you to do. Now, typically with the long essay question, we try to encourage students to pick themes from the course that could help them organize their essay. So this is part of the brainstorming process. You need to go back to the 5 themes that we've covered in class, like the environmental, or sometimes we abbreviate it as GEO. So geographic, causes or effects or similarities or differences, so on and so forth. Cultural developments and interactions, noting that interactions typically happen through trade or conquest. So that's where we would get our cultural diffusion as one language spreads from area A to area B, so on and so forth. Governance covers the government or the political topic. That SB just means state building. Okay, so how do they build a state? How do they govern? Economic systems, that's when we're talking about things like trade. What are they importing? What are they exporting? What are the routes that are being used? Are they using feudalism or the Mita system or the encomienda? Social interactions and organizations, that's talking about that hierarchy that we love to talk about in AP history. Okay, so like if you're talking about the social organization of the Mongols prior to building their empire, it's not going to be very stratified. It's not going to have a lot of different levels. It's going to have whoever's in charge and then everybody else. But if you were, for instance, to talk about feudal Europe in period 1, at the top you'd have a king who's pretty detached, very decentralized, and the nobles underneath him would actually have the most power because they would be holding the most wealth, and they would have vassals that would depend on them and be loyal to them. So you could go from king to noble to knight, and then get down to the peasants and eventually the serfs. With technology and innovation, innovation by definition means something new. So for technology, we could talk about lateen sails and how that innovation allowed for Indian Ocean trade to account for the monsoon winds. We could talk about the chinampas built by the Aztec in Tenochtitlan, where they actually physically expanded their land in Lake Texcoco in order to increase the amount of agriculture that they could carry out so that they could support their population. You could talk about gunpowder weapons and how the Mongols used that for siege cannons or siege weapons like cannons, or how the conquistadors used that type of weapon to dominate in the New World as we move into period 2. Okay, so really with this, you're just trying to figure out, when I'm talking about causation, cause and effect, am I going to talk about political causes and effects, economic causes and effects, religious causes and effects, which would fall under culture? So religion, language, food, customs, belief systems, gender roles. Okay, that could all fall under culture there. Basically, these themes are helping to organize your essay into body paragraph topics so that you could have a proper topic sentence and then put all of your evidence and analysis under that umbrella of that specific topic. So just a reminder, the LEQ is written in 40 minutes. 5 of those minutes are going to be spent brainstorming. The remaining 35 need to be spent writing the essay. You do need a thesis. That is a whole point in the rubric. That is just your claim or your line of reasoning. Okay, if it asks you to compare and contrast the labor systems used in period 1, then you're going to have to give some similarities and differences. For instance, a similarity between feudalism and the Mita system was that neither parties got paid for their labor. Okay, they were either in a reciprocal kind of relationship where they got to stay on land in exchange for service, or they were contributing towards the building up of their empire, like with the Inca in their Mita system, having boys ages 15 to 50 working on infrastructure and projects like the Carpanon. Okay, so you could focus on the similarities and that it was unpaid labor, and then you can move on to differences between those types of labor. You do not need to write all 3 of the LEQ prompts. You only need to pick one. No one is expecting you to write 3 essays in 40 minutes. That would be impossible. Now, when it gets to your body paragraphs, you're going to want at least 2 body paragraphs. So if you did political similarities and social differences between 2 empires, those would be good categories for a body paragraph. And the very first sentence of your body paragraph needs to be a topic sentence. Okay, this needs to go back to your thesis. So if your thesis said that rulers used both religion to legitimize their rule and architecture to legitimize their right to rule, then you're going to need to break that down to a topic sentence for the first body paragraph. So you had 2 body paragraphs of architecture and religion, okay, but you're only going to focus on one at a time. So for instance, this topic sentence might focus on how rulers during period 1 used religious methods of legitimacy. So you could say that empires in China used religion to legitimize their rule through the mandate of heaven. Then you've got to give evidence that defines that word that you just used, the mandate of heaven, or describes which empires in China, which dynasties used that method, and then you've got to use that to defend your claim. So I could talk about how the Song and the Tang dynasties utilized the mandate of heaven in order to keep power when things were going well. Okay, so the gods were pleased with the emperor and his dynasty when there were no famines, when there was plenty of food, when there were times of peace. Hence why the creation or the founding of champa rice from Vietnam was very important for the Song and the Tang dynasty. If they don't have enough food, then the people might overthrow them. So they used infrastructure like the Grand Canal to move champa rice production, that food that they had grown in the south, to the manufacturing north where there wasn't as much agriculture, thus providing food for their population that allowed them to endure. On the other hand, though, if they did not keep the mandate of heaven, if they somehow lost that mandate, then that gave the people in China the right to rebel and to overthrow them. Okay, so like we might see the fall of the Tang dynasty, okay, due to An Lushan's rebellion, right? Things weren't going so well, taxes were high, food supply was low, so the people rose up and attempted to overthrow the Tang dynasty through a military coup. Then we get the Song dynasty in charge. So you could write about how that mandate of heaven answers the question by saying it uses religious aspects like the gods approve of the emperor's rule, and thus you need to stay in your lane and follow that particular emperor, versus when things start going poorly, this gives an opportunity to overthrow the ruling dynasty and replace it with a more effective government. Okay, so why would this be historically significant? Okay, well, the fact that their religious legitimacy allows for rebellion in certain cases does kind of weaken the ability of these dynasties to last as long as they might have otherwise. Okay, it also allows for them to legitimize their rule when things are going well, basically saying that they have the favor of the gods, and if you go against the gods, right, then you're probably not a very great person. I mean, people are not going to want to just overthrow the dynasty and be on the wrong side of the gods' favor. Okay, so that can be something that can be very strong in keeping the dynasty in charge, or it could have a counter effect of actually giving a reason for that dynasty to be overthrown. Your body paragraph is basically going to be 2 to 3 of these SAQs with your topic sentence, your evidence sentence, and your analysis sentence. So if I wanted to go beyond just China using religion to legitimize their rule, then I might focus on something like period 1. I might focus on something like the Abbasid Empire, right, when they had established a caliph who held both religious and political power, and that Abu Abbas claimed that he was not only chosen by the Ummah to rule over the dynasty or the caliphate, but that he was also a distant relative of the prophet. Okay, so using religious figures like that in order to cement your rule could also be another SAQ that you put into that particular body paragraph covering religion. So this is the rubric for the LEQ. The first 2 points here are in the intro paragraph. So you have the thesis statement and the context statement. Okay, so on your Pear Deck, if you're following along with this, these would be the points on the rubric that you would circle or highlight in blue, okay, because they belong in the intro. Now the thesis needs to be at the end of the intro paragraph. Okay, this is where you should be putting your thesis so it is easy to identify for the reader, so we know where to look for it. And if you look at the criteria for the thesis, you must respond to the question with a historically defensible thesis or claim that establishes a line of reasoning. So what this means is it has to be something that is historically defensible. If you say, for instance, that the Abbasid dynasty tried to keep rule by forcing conversions to Islam so everyone would follow the same rules, that would not be historically defensible. Okay, claiming that the majority of the Islamic empires had to force conversions would not be factual, so that would not be something that you could use as defensible for a thesis. In terms of a line of reasoning, it's talking about, are you covering continuity and change? Are you covering cause and effect? Or are you covering similarities and differences, like with that little Venn diagram there? Okay, so you need to respond to the question and answer the question with a claim that you can actually prove. Now, occasionally we do have the issue of students just repeating the question rather than actually answering the question. Okay, so if you had a prompt that asked for the effects of COVID-19 on the United States, and you just responded with, there were many effects of COVID-19 on the United States. Well, that's not answering the question. You didn't tell me what were the effects. Were they economic? Were they political? Were they social? Were they positive? Were they negative? You just told me that, yes, there are effects. That's like if somebody asked you, hey, how are you doing today? And you just responded with, yes, I am. Like, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't answer the question. Another point that I want to bring up is that the thesis has to be in one of two locations. It has to be in your intro or your conclusion. You can have it in both if you like. Like if in your intro you tried to write a thesis, but it's, not as good as you wanted it to be, but after you've written the essay, you get to the conclusion and you're like, okay, I know how to say this much better. You can have the thesis in the intro or the conclusion, but you cannot have it in the body paragraph. That's why it's so important to indent your paragraphs to show the reader what is your intro versus body paragraph so we don't get confused. And that's also why you shouldn't just do context and then skip a line and then start doing thesis. It has to be together in the intro, because if it's not in the first or the last paragraph, then we can't give you the point, even if it's the most beautiful thesis we've ever seen. Context is the remainder of the intro paragraph. So if thesis is 1 to 2 sentences, then your context is going to be 3 to 4 or sometimes even 5 sentences. And that's because the point cannot be rewarded for a phrase or a reference. Okay, if you gave me context on the Columbian Exchange and you just said, in 1492 Chris Columbus sailed the ocean blue, that's just a phrase or a reference. You're not actually giving detail about who sent Christopher Columbus to the West, why was he going west in the first place, what were they searching for in the first place. You're just saying that, this dude did this thing at this time. That's not broader historical events or developments. Okay, so if you just have one sentence of context, you're not going to get the point. And context can be before the time period in the prompt, during the time period, or after the time period. After the time period is a lot more difficult to do. Okay, I would recommend sticking with before or during the time period. So like if you had a question on comparing and contrasting Buddhism and Christianity in period 1. Okay, good context for before could be the origins of Buddhism, like from India and then how it spread to China, or how it rejected the Hindu caste system, and then the context for Christianity. Where did it start? Where did it become dominant? Then you can go into the characteristics of how is the religion, or are the religions the same, and how are they different in your body paragraphs. Okay, so that could be before with the origins, or you could talk about during, where were they currently dominant in terms of the time period. So if you have an essay on period 1, Christianity is obviously going to be dominant in Europe, not Africa, not Asia. Okay, if you're talking about period 1 and comparing Buddhism, well, Buddhism was not as popular in India or South Asia because it had to contend with Hinduism, which was a strong continuity. But it did gain traction in China, where it didn't have another religion to really compete with as much there. It just had a philosophy, Confucianism, which it then was able to syncretize with. Okay, so that could be your during the time period information. It's much more difficult to get the after the time period. So you need to describe a broader historical context or background that is relevant to the prompt. So not just random facts about what happened in that time period, but something that is actually relevant to the prompt. For instance, if somebody asked me how I'm doing today, and I said, as my thesis statement, I'm not doing very well, all right, they say, give me some context for that. What's been going on, during this day that's made things not go very well for you. Well, if I go all the way back to my birth and say, like, that's where all the problems started, right? That's way too far back to be relevant. I can't talk about the time that I bumped my head into a corner of a table and got a scar on my eyebrow, because that has nothing to do with today, right? So I have to make sure that my context is also relevant to what I'm discussing. So I wouldn't go all the way back to 2nd grade or 4th grade to talk about why I feel the way I feel today. Instead, I might talk about the night before when my cats woke me up, walking across me, or they threw up a hairball and I had to get up and, find them and take care of them. So I only got 3 hours of sleep. Something like that would be appropriate context, because it's close enough to the time period that it's relevant. It's not just random facts from the past. So your intro total should be about 4 to 5 or more sentences. Okay, because you don't want just a phrase or a reference for your context. Okay, and typically your thesis is only going to be one sentence, but occasionally as it gets more complex or you add a counter argument, it could be 2 sentences. But we're not going through and counting the sentences. We just need to know, is there enough information to give them the points? And your context is going to have specific factual information. So if your essay is on comparing and contrasting Islam and Christianity and their spread, right? You might give context by talking about the founders of each religion. Well, if you just said some dude in Jerusalem founded Christianity, well, that's not going to be very specific factual information. If you said that the Prophet Muhammad founded Christianity, well, that'd be specific, but it wouldn't be factual information. You've got to give me some proper nouns or some vocabulary terms, okay, that help to set the stage. So you could talk about how the Prophet Muhammad came from the Bedouin tribe, which had typically been a polytheistic group that traveled with caravans throughout the Arabian desert. You could talk about how Christianity became adopted in Rome after Constantinople converted to it in the 300s with the Edict of Milan. That doesn't answer the question of compare and contrast, okay, because that's thesis, but it does set the stage for describing those religions, so background info. Then you're going to go to your body paragraphs. Okay, your body paragraphs are going to be eligible for 2 evidence points and 2 analysis points. So the very first sentence in your body paragraph needs to be the topic sentence. So this is something that relates back to your thesis. Like if you said there were religious similarities between 2 empires, then you would focus on that topic. So the Abbasid Empire and the Umayyad Caliphate both shared similarities in the religion they practiced. That would be your topic sentence. Then you're going to have to give me evidence proving that claim. Okay, so if I said that both the Umayyad and the Abbasid were Catholic, well, that wouldn't be factual evidence. It has to be something factual. I would have to say that they were both Islamic. That would be a specific piece of evidence that's relevant to the prompt that I could use to get some points. I could also talk about how the Umayyad dynasty was known for their love of wealth, and they were known for corruption and not being as religiously tolerant or tolerant towards the Mawali, or non-Arabs who converted to Islam. And then that would give me 2 pieces of specific facts. I've already said that they were Muslim, that they're Islamic. And then I've also said that the Umayyad were different from the Abbasid and that they discriminated against the Mawali. Okay, if I can identify, okay, just name drop basically, identify specific historical examples relevant to the prompt, then I get that first point. So by saying Islam or Sunni, right, I've said, and Mawali, I've said enough to get that first point. Now I need to use that evidence in my argument to get the second point. I need to use that evidence specifically to support my claim. Well, my claim was that the Umayyad and the Abbasid had a similarity in terms of their religion and that they were both Islamic. Okay, so I would have to say that the Umayyad dynasty was Muslim and came to be after the death of the final rightly guided Caliph, Ali. And then eventually they were overthrown by the Abbasid, who were also Sunni Islam, like the Umayyad, although they took a more tolerant approach to how they ruled over the empire, including treating the Arab population that converted to Islam more equitably than the Umayyad had before them. Then you're going to get into your analysis. Okay, so the analysis is, why is this historically significant? So you could talk about how this was historically significant because the Umayyad dynasty did not last nearly as long as the Abbasid. Typically, empires that do not embrace tolerance tend to be overthrown more quickly, whereas empires that do accept and tolerate the diversity of the empire that they rule over tend to have fewer problems, at least when it comes to religion, because at this period of time, religion was all-encompassing. That was one of the most important things to people. So that moves us over to the rest of our body paragraph with analysis. So, do you use historical reasoning skills, comparison, causation, or continuity and change, to frame or structure your essay? Well, my topic sentence helps with that because I've already covered how I'm comparing and contrasting two empires, the Umayyad and the Abbasid. Okay, so even if I don't go into the differences, if I just do similarities, okay, it could be unbalanced or uneven, like I'm only covering similarities and not covering differences, but that's still enough to get that first point. That second point is the complexity point, and that is a lot more difficult to get. Okay, you can't just cover similarities, you would have to cover differences. Okay, typically you're going to have to cover more than one historical thinking skill. So it wouldn't just be similarities and differences, but you'd also have to look at causation or continuity and change. You can't just have two pieces of factual evidence supporting your claim. You would need to have at least four, and you'd have to use them to support your nuanced or complex argument. So not just name dropping more facts like the names of the 4 rightly guided caliphs or talking about the Delhi Sultanate, but instead actually using it to back up your essay and back up your claim. Okay, so exploring multiple causes or effects, multiple similarities, differences, multiple continuities or changes, explaining both sides of the historical thinking skill, cause and effect, similarity and differences, connecting across time periods or geographical areas. This is fairly difficult for students to do. An example that I use in class is if I gave an essay prompt about COVID, right? And in that essay, the student compared the outbreak of COVID and the United States response to the outbreak of the Spanish flu in the 1918s and the U.S. response. That would be something that's relevant and something that you could connect together because both were airborne diseases that diffused into the United States and both resulted in lockdowns and mask wearing, right? So that would be a relevant connection rather than just throwing in something like bubonic plague, which wouldn't be as relevant. You can also get the complexity point by showing a sophisticated understanding of different perspectives relevant to the prompt. Okay, again, with the complexity point, this is not something that we're going to lose a lot of sleep over trying to get, especially as freshmen. Okay, but you don't want to leave these easy points like thesis, context, and evidence on the table because you're trying so hard to get the unicorn point. It's also important to note that complexity is more than a phrase or a reference. Okay, so you can't just give me one sentence of complexity and then think, oh, I'm going to get the point. It's going to take multiple topic sentences, multiple body paragraphs, typically 3, multiple pieces of evidence, and some other insightful connections. That's why it's called the complexity point, is because it is so complex. So in addressing these points with relevant experiences that students have had, I typically will give them the prompt of evaluate the impact of COVID on the United States. Okay, so when we look at what we're supposed to do with our theme, with our question, we are supposed to identify the historical thinking skill. So which historical thinking skill do you think goes with impact? If you said causation, you would be correct, because impact is another word for effect. So the main idea we're looking for here is effects on the U.S. Not on China, not on Australia, not on the North Pole, okay, but just the impacts of COVID, the effects of COVID on the United States. When it comes to the time frame, we know that COVID started in China in 2019, but it really hit in the U.S. in 2020. And that's still something that's affecting us and ongoing today, even into 2023. Okay, so we're looking at the 2020s in general as we evaluate the impact of COVID on the United States. Okay, so it's important to note that your intro is going to be made up of context, which is 3 to 5 sentences, and it's going to need a thesis, which is typically 1 sentence, but can be 2 depending on how complex it is. It's important to note that context is always going to be in the intro. Okay, so you can't say that your thesis is covering context, because context is already in the 3 to 5 sentences preceding your thesis. Your thesis has to be causation, comparison, or continuity and change. As you're brainstorming, you're going to want to figure out which of these categories, okay, could best answer the question of the types of impacts on the United States. Okay, now don't say economical effects, because economical just means cheap. Okay, instead, you're going to want to say something along the lines of economic effects, positive economic effects, negative economic effects. Okay, so if you're going through and trying to brainstorm evidence that could go with these different body paragraphs, you'll figure out that some of the body paragraph topics can get more evidence than others. Like with environmental, I may be able to talk about how people drove less because they're on lockdown and gas prices decreased and that helped with the environment, but that's not going to be as much evidence as talking about the economic effects of COVID. There was a lot going on with the economy as it related to COVID, with like the supply chain issue, with shortages of computer chips, with the increase in prices of cars due to the shortage of computer chips, or the shortage of toilet paper and hand sanitizer. Okay, all of that would be more relevant and more en masse in terms of the evidence than just environmental. Okay, so it's important to note you don't have to answer all of these topics of political effects, economic effects, social, religious, environmental effects. Okay, but instead you should pick 2 to 3. Okay, and you're going to want to pick the ones that you know the most about. If you don't know about any religious effects of COVID on the United States, then don't pick it. You don't want to write about that. So one of the homework assignments that I give in this unit is I tell students to create an outline using this prompt and then identify which body paragraph category has the most evidence. So they're going to pick their body paragraph categories from this list, or they could have one that they make their own, like cultural effects. Okay, it's really open-ended as opposed to a multiple choice test where there's only one answer. But typically when I answer this prompt, I think of economic and political and social. So now I'm going to come up with my evidence for each of those. So with economic, toilet paper shortage, stocks went down. You could talk about the stock market also with the AMC or the meme stocks. Let's see, you could talk about the stimulus bills. Okay, those checks that came out. So let's say checks instead of bills. Stimulus checks. PPP loans for businesses that they didn't have to pay back, but they got to keep people on their payroll. Let's see. Oh, unemployment increasing. Online shopping increasing. Price gouging, like we saw with hand sanitizer. So already my eco body paragraph is looking pretty strong. Now moving on to political evidence. We could talk about, unrest over topics like masks and vaccinations and school shutdowns. Okay, those are big political talking points. during 2020. You could also talk about how there was a presidential election during that time. So you have conflict, you have unrest, you have, the dividing of political parties. Now, this isn't to say that you get to make a stump speech in your body paragraph. It's not like you're going to say, so-and-so stole the election, or actually, no, it wasn't stolen, so on and so forth. You're not making those statements as if they're facts, like so-and-so was wrong, or this party was better, or any of that kind of opinion-based statements. Instead, you would have to make it more objective, like there was a segment of the population who felt there was corruption relating to the vaccinations or relating to a political election, or there were a group of people who saw the anti-vaxxers as a threat to public health. And then fights broke out over wearing a mask. People were shot in some cases over being told you have to wear a mask or not wear a mask, so on and so forth. Okay, so really looking at it from a more objective view rather than giving your own personal opinion, because opinions don't really have a place in a historical essay. It's more so about a historically defensible claim and the evidence that backs that up. Now, with social effects, we could talk about the effects of isolation, okay, things like learning loss with online school, rates of depression, mental health. Okay, that could be some evidence that we talk about with our social body paragraph. But already I can tell what my answer to this is going to be, okay, which body paragraph category has the most evidence. It's going to be my economic body paragraph, okay, because I can just list those on and on and on. Analysis is going to be a little bit more difficult because you have to answer, okay, why is this significant? Why does it matter that there are all these negative things going on in the economy, that toilet paper was going through a shortage, that stocks were going down, that unemployment was going up? Well, you could talk about how this was the year of a presidential election. And typically when things go wrong with society, or there's a famine or a war or a spread of a disease, people tend to blame the government that was currently in charge at the time, right? And so we are going to see that the Republican Party takes a hit and loses the election to the Democratic Party. Now, this isn't trying to make a statement of like, oh, well, it was this party's fault or this party could have done it better, but simply a statement that at that time period, the Republican Party was in charge. And so with everything going on with COVID, they took a big political hit, okay, because there was a perception that they weren't doing enough or that they were doing the wrong things in response to COVID. Okay, and then there are people promising, hey, vote for me, and I'll institute this change. I'll either lock things down more or open things up more, so on and so forth, and that has an impact on the election as well. You could also, for analysis, when talking about the school shutdowns and the masks and the vaccinations and the presidential election leading to a change in party rule, that this then led to bigger conflicts like the insurrection on January 6th. Okay, so bringing in the whole concept of a peaceful transfer of power from one party to the next, and how that type of violence at the Capitol hadn't been seen since the War of 1812. Okay, that could even get you the complexity point because you're connecting it to something in another time period that is relevant. And then for social effects and how that is historically significant, well, obviously we see the effects on learning loss and mental health. So you could see an increase in deaths related to mental health and also a decrease in the progress of children as it relates to reading and math scores and basically being on level. Right? So already in just like the 5 minutes of brainstorming, we've already worked out some key evidence, some body paragraph categories, and analysis, moving us closer to that second analysis point, the complexity point. I wanted to go through the basic parts of the essay as it related to our prompt of the effects of COVID on the United States. So the first thing that we're going to do in writing our essay is an intro paragraph, and the intro paragraph is going to have a context point and a thesis point. So here I have an example of some context, and I'm going to highlight the parts of the context that includes specific factual information that doesn't answer the question, it doesn't answer the prompt of effects on the United States, but it does give us some context or background information on the topic. So prior to the outbreak of COVID-19 in Wuhan, China, the United States had been a global superpower engaged in large-scale trade across the world. Despite the thriving economy, political tensions in the U.S. were high. Social unrest led to protests as the Republican administration held the presidential office. COVID arrived at an unfortunate time for the Republican re-election campaign efforts in 2020, further exacerbating the tense political climate. Exacerbating meaning making it worse. So you'll notice that this context wasn't just a phrase or a reference. Okay? It wasn't just COVID broke out in Wuhan, China in 2019. Okay? Instead, I'm relating it specifically to the prompt of effects on the U.S. Okay? So it going from China to the United States. So prior to COVID, the United States had been a global superpower. They had a thriving economy, but even prior to COVID, there were some political tensions and social unrest, right? And then starting with who is running the United States at that time, the Republican administration that had already been kicking off its efforts for a re-election campaign, because obviously you don't start running for re-election in the year of the election. You have to start prior to that. Okay, so we're talking about how there was a tense political climate, the economy was thriving, the United States was powerful and engaged in large-scale trade across the road. So even kind of a nod towards how COVID managed to make its way from the other hemisphere to the United States. That's going to be through trade and travel. So now that we've got our multiple sentences of context that are more than a phrase or a reference, we can move into our thesis statement. Okay, this answers the question of effects COVID had on the United States. So you'll notice in blue, I've squared the words that indicate our historical thinking skill of causation. So due to, because of, right? That's cause and effect. So due to the rapid spread of COVID in the United States due to trade and travel, political tensions reached new heights as both political parties attempted to win votes from an increasingly divided electorate and as lockdowns slowed down the U.S. economy. Okay, so I really very clearly have a claim, two claims actually, in my thesis. Okay, my first claim is that political tensions increased because of COVID. My second claim is that the economy was slowed down because of COVID lockdowns. So already I'm going to have a political effects paragraph, and I'm going to have an economic effects paragraph. If I wanted to add in a third body paragraph to try to go for those for that complexity point, I might look at technological effects, okay, in terms of an expansion of technology. So this could be more positive to counter the more negative and thus move me closer to complexity with the nuance of the argument. It's not all bad or all good. Instead, it's a mixture of the two. So like with technology, I could talk about the access to computers and the access to software like Zoom, as educators were given a free year trial in order to kind of pick up the pieces as we never returned from spring break and still had to reach our kids. You could talk about the rise in virtual reality in terms of people being more and more interested in that. Okay, so that could be another body paragraph that we address if we have time in the 38 minutes. So now y'all are going to see the topic sentence that we have and the evidence that we use to back up the claim we make in the topic sentence. So, our first body paragraph. COVID negatively impacted the United States government as the government response to the pandemic raised political ire. Ire meaning anger. So this is our political tension increasing body paragraph. So I need to provide my claim, anger at the government, and then I need to provide my evidence. So my evidence of anger at the government includes protests. What were those protests over? Well, there were protests over the lockdowns of businesses and churches. There were protests over masks and whether a mask mandate meant you had to wear the mask or if you still had the ability to not wear the mask, right? Very contentious topic. There are also protests over virtual school. There are some people who are saying we should go 100% virtual, and then other people saying, no, we should have a hybrid model, so some virtual, some face-to-face, and others saying, nope, just open up the schools entirely, right? That wasn't an easy situation. There was a lot of heated moments in, that discussion over what should we do in response to this outbreak. So already I have a ton of evidence with lockdowns, masks, and virtual school protests, and how that anger was directed at the government, whether it's the state government or the district over a school system, or if it's directed at the president and the political party that's in charge of Congress or the executive branch. Then my other claim, the election year, it negatively impacted politics because it was an election year. So evidence of that. Well, there was conflict over stimulus bills. Who should get them and how much should they be, or should they be given at all? There were issues over a new presidential administration, taking over after the 2020 elections, and then conflict over that as well, along with conspiracy theories and things like QAnon and so on and so forth. So I've already provided a topic sentence saying, hey, I'm going to talk about negative effects, and then I gave evidence of those negative political effects. The anger at the government and the change in government brought on since this was an election year. Then in my next body paragraph, new topic sentence. COVID harmed the U.S. economy. Again, we're making a claim of negative effects on the economy. So how did they harm the economy, or how did it harm the economy? As lockdowns impacted consumer spending. So the lockdowns had effects on consumers spending money. So the first claim, there were supply shortages that harmed the economy. Now I need to back up that claim. Well, what were the supplies that we were short on? We were short on toilet paper, on protective equipment, the PPE. We were short on microchips for computers, especially as schools were ordering more computers to be one-to-one and to provide equitable access to all students, or even like those little Wi-Fi hotspots that they would send home with students, or get buses hooked up with Wi-Fi and then park them in the middle of a neighborhood, right? That costs a lot of money, and it changed the supply and demand of what was in high supply before COVID versus now what is everybody buying up, and in some cases hoarding. Another claim, price gouging and inflation. Hand sanitizer went up extremely high in price. Bleach, you couldn't find bleach anywhere. And it was extremely high in price. Masks, like now you can buy masks like super easily, like 100 in a box for less than $10, but it used to be that people were paying extreme amounts of money for N95 masks. That could even be evidence if you talk about the specific type of masks that were in demand. Plexiglass dividers. Before we didn't really have plexiglass dividers at the grocery store or in between desks at school, but now there's a much higher demand for that. So consumer spending on certain objects like toilet paper or hand sanitizer, cleaning supplies, technology supplies, protective equipment, all of that is going to be an impact due to COVID. Okay, then with your third body paragraph, if you have time, okay, you could maybe focus on positive technological effects, like the expansion of technology as more schools went one-to-one, the access to software that allowed for connecting with students or with loved ones regardless of the social distancing. Then your last paragraph should be your conclusion. You technically don't need a conclusion because it's the same points as the intro. That would be a context point and a thesis point. But let's say that you didn't write a very good thesis at the beginning. Well, now this is your opportunity to restate your thesis more clearly now that you've actually gone through the process of writing the essay and you're like, oh yeah, I know exactly what my points were. So you don't want to do a word-for-word copy of your thesis in your context, okay, but instead word it in a different way and see if you can make it clearer just in case your intro thesis didn't qualify for the points. Okay, so then you need to make sure that you proved your point, that you supported your claim, and that you answered the question. The question was impact of COVID on the U.S., and your first body paragraph was negative political effects, and your second body paragraph was negative economic effects. Okay, that does answer the question because it asked us for impacts. So now if you can take those sentences, that outline, and then put them together into a essay with one intro and two or more body paragraphs, then you're set up very nicely for gaining those points off of the rubric that we looked at in